Good afternoon. Okay, so one of the things that's helpful for me is I'm going to be speaking to you. I'm going to ask you to participate. And one of the ways that I'll do that is by my address. Another way is through also asking you to do some thinking about this topic. So I'm going to start again. Good afternoon. Oh, that was so good. Thank you very much. So I was honored to be asked about the topic of diversity and to come here and speak with you about that and really provide a forum for us to think together about this topic, harnessing the power of diversity by uncovering unconscious bias. There are lots of ways to think about diversity. I like to talk about it through unconscious bias. And this is a topic that I've been paying some attention to since 1987. I've been looking at this topic of diversity. So here's what I'm going to do really quickly with you, because I understand that I have a limited amount of time before we get to the panel, which I'm very interested in hearing from. But I want to talk with you some about, so what is diversity and why should we care about it? What's the importance of studying this topic? I'm going to focus on it from this concept of unconscious bias. I'm going to tell you really quickly what is unconscious bias. What are some of the sources? I'm going to be curious about how you actually might have experienced unconscious bias. What are the implications for organizations? I'll talk with you a tiny bit just about what do you do as you see unconscious bias, and I'll close out by bringing us back to diversity and talking about what some of the powerful paradigms around diversity are. I'm going to come to you, and so I'm giving you a heads up at the very end for closing thoughts. From just 3 or so people, if you could tell me what stands out for you about what I'm going to share with you, that would be very helpful. So do me a favor, just nod your head that you get this. Just give me a nod. Okay, great. Okay. So in your folders, there should be a worksheet. Is that right? Can you pull it out? It's a worksheet that looks like this. It just has about 8 questions. And there is one question that I'd like for you to start with. When we hear this term diversity, we had great opening comments about what does it mean, but I'd like for you to write down, what is diversity? What's your definition of it? So please just take 1 minute and write down, what's diversity? If you could take a second and write down your definition. Okay, your definition of diversity. Okay, I want to get one definition from each one of these sections. And so I'm going to go right over here first. Can somebody from right here give me what's your definition of diversity? Somebody from right over here. Anybody? Somebody want to start? Getting different people from different backgrounds. Different backgrounds, different cultures. Thanks for starting that. What about from right in here, this swap? Definition of diversity, yes.
So diversity is working and living with multilingual, multicultural and multinational people with different abilities and competencies.
Wow, that's a good definition. Working and living with people with different abilities, multilingual, different competencies. Can everybody hear me? Okay, that's a great, I'm going to take you home. That's a good definition right there. That's a very good definition. Right over here, right here.
Choices,
Yeah.
science, new thinking, seeing boldly. All angles covered, different inputs, conflict, contradiction, all defined choices.
Like that, choices, right, decisions. Makes me, I love that. Great, right here. Great, so there are all these parameters that people are paying attention to, but diversity is differences in the way that people think and act based on all these different demographic factors that might come into play. Wow, this is great. These are fantastic definitions. And what I like that you didn't do is that you didn't get stuck in the concept of diversity means that you're a different race or a different gender or a different ethnicity. I appreciate that you all got beyond that right away. It's a way of acting. It's having different perspectives. It's having all these different things. You have questions? You want a definition? Yes.
My definition was involving
Something called white. What I appreciate is that you all did not fall into the common trend of thinking that diversity is that we're different race, different gender, different culture, and that's it. I like that you got to action. What are the different actions? Right, so some of the definitions that I like, really perceive differences among people that affect their interactions and relationships, and also the varied perspectives and approaches to work that members of different identity groups bring. Ties into some of what you said and some of what you said. Right, so notice that it's not just about demographic diversity. It's not that, and that's oftentimes what we fall down and think that it's only about that. Okay, so it's important for us to start with this because for two reasons. Right, so first is that understand thinking about diversity is challenging. It's hard work, but it's important. Our opening speakers, I think, made the case for you that we don't really have a choice about dealing with diversity. You're facing it, you're going to face it, we have opportunities to learn and leverage it, but it's not actually easy. And so one thing that is this term called diversity fatigue. Actually, I'm really tired of thinking of this concept already. Right? So it's diversity fatigue, mental exhaustion brought on by the constant attention required to ensure that a workforce or other group is diverse along a variety of dimensions of social identity. Right? So that we can see that people are kind of stressed about this. Because you don't have a choice, you have to deal with it. It's really important. Right? So we want to pay attention to the fact that there's this fatigue issue. On the same side, there is a need to pay attention to the fact that we look at diversity through many different lenses. That it's not just looking at how do we get more people to fit here, but actually we can look at diversity through a couple of different frameworks. Because we're not looking solely at diversity from the perspective of discrimination. It's got more subtle than that. We have to think about it beyond just discrimination. Like that. Let's think about how do we leverage and harness the power of diversity. And part of how you can do that is using different frameworks, right? So these are some of the frameworks that I use to look at diversity through divergent lenses, right? To pay attention to diversity. At the heart of these, diversity is really there. So mentoring is what I've built Mentoring is what I've built my work on. It's my legacies through looking at mentoring, particularly for women of color. I'm very excited about the data that I collected looking at professional Indian women and what we'll get to learn from that. So mentoring is a big thing. How is it that we develop people? How is it that we develop people who are different from us, right? And mentoring is one of the ways that we see that happening. Another way that we see this is through what we call bystander awareness. So bystander awareness is what happens if you see something, and you're in an organization, you see something happen, and you didn't do it, and it didn't happen to you. Does that make sense? You see something, and you're like, I don't know that I like that, I'm not sure that I agree with it. You didn't do it, but you saw it. And it didn't happen to you, but you saw it. So what do? Well, there's a whole new stream of research, not new actually, it's been around for a while, called bystander awareness, where you have some actions for what will you do if you see something happen, you're not the perpetrator, but you have to do something. This research was started off by looking at the case of a young woman in New York City who was returning home, and as she was returning home, she was actually assaulted. She was murdered. 38 people saw the murder. But it took about 23 minutes for anybody to call for help. The assaultant came, he stabbed her, he left, he came back, he stabbed her again, he left, he came back, he stabbed her, and she died. And people said, what happened that this could occur, that this young woman could be killed while 38 people watched? Does that mean the people of New York are cold-hearted? What's going on? Well, the social psychological research said that there's this bystander awareness concept that sometimes we freeze when we see something happen and we're not quite sure what to do. Does that make sense? Right? Because so another way to get at diversity is to think about how do we deal with bystander apathy. The third way that I'm going to talk with you about is unconscious bias. Unconscious bias, and this is yet another way to think about how it is that we deal with diversity. Okay, so should we pay attention to unconscious bias? Should we pay attention to diversity? Your opening speakers definitely have laid the case, but just to reinforce it, we need to pay attention because A, you all have biases. Every single one of you has a bias, right? If you don't know what it is, find me after this session. I'll sit down with you, we'll have some tea, and I'll tell you, okay? We'll figure it out together. Everybody has biases. And as a matter of fact, you're working with different constituents who are more diverse. You're working with people who are more diverse. No choice about that. You have to learn how to deal with diversity because it is what you're going to be facing. The world is becoming more and more diverse. And finally, you're going to compete and collaborate with people and organizations all around the globe. And so not only will diversity be a part of your day-to-day interactions, it also will need to be part of your strategy, okay? Just in case I haven't convinced you, let me give you a couple of statistics, right? There's up here in terms of looking at how is it that the world is changing. The last one, it's very interesting to me as I look out at this audience, that India has the largest Gen Y population in the world. The largest Gen Y population in the world. And in 2020, India will have a disproportionate number of young people entering the workforce. The median age will be 29. So that's just one dimension, is looking at age. Another dimension is certainly looking at gender. I have the pleasure of teaching a gender and leadership course at the Indian School of Business. And when I prepare to come here to teach that course, it's quite interesting when I do my background research to see where India is in relation to dealing with gender. And my thoughts are based on what I'm learning, there's some opportunity there, right? There's some opportunity for us in terms of thinking about gender. Okay, so here's the impetus. You guys don't have a choice. Have to think about dealing with diversity because, in fact, that's what we'll be doing. Okay, so with the amount of time that I have left with you, I'm just going to do a couple of things. Help us think about unconscious bias as a way to deal with diversity. Think about what are some of the norms and traditions that contribute to these biases, and talk just a tiny bit about what some of the best practices are in terms of identifying cultural and organizational biases. Okay, so first, I'm just going to do a quick primer on what do we mean by unconscious bias. This is not my work. This is from colleagues Banerjee, Bazerman, and Chu. They have a great article called How Unethical Are You? That talks about unconscious bias. It's a Harvard Business Review piece, and it's really quite good. And so here's the thing. We all have an illusion of objectivity. We all think that we're objective. We can see in other people that they're not, but we don't see it in ourselves, right? So we're clear that other people are not objective. We understand that, but we think we're pretty objective. All of us do, right? And so if I had more time with you, I'd actually ask you to go to a website and take these tests. And I put the website up here in case people want to go visit it. It's a global study that's being sponsored through Harvard's psychology department with the Professor Banerjee that I mentioned in the article. So this is a website that you could go to and you can take an implicit association test. They have all kinds of tests that you can take. And what happens is you take the test, and right as you finish, you'll get a score that lets you know whether you're biased along that particular dimension or not. It's really quite interesting. They're collecting data, and it's happening all over the world. So this is a global test, right? And if I had more time with you, I'd ask you to consider some questions. I'd ask you to think about which test did you take, and do you agree with the results? And how do you think unconscious bias affects your relationships? And what are some suggestions you might offer? But I don't have that time with you, right? So take those questions out of here after this conversation and think about them, right? Okay, so why it's important to pay attention to unconscious bias as a way to think about diversity is that it's widely prevalent, it's quite robust, it is contrary to our conscious intention. We don't think we are biased. Actually, sometimes we're pretty certain we're not, and in fact we are, and it's quite costly to organizations. Unconscious bias is quite costly. So what we see is that 75% of test takers with the test that's being run out of Harvard show an implicit bias favoring the young, favoring the rich and favoring whites. Is this surprising to you? Not really, right? Not really. Okay, so let me tell you about the 4 sources of unconscious bias. Now, as I'm telling you what they are, I want you to think about if you've ever experienced one of them or if you have done one of them, if you've been the person who's actually been the perpetrator of unconscious bias. Okay, so just give me a nod that you're going to do that for me. Just give me a nod. I'm just looking. I'm looking over here. Okay, great. Okay, so let me tell you about these 4 sources. The first is implicit prejudice, and this is, and think about this also. Each one of these really deals with diversity, right? So each one of these is about diversity, the way that we've been talking about it. Okay, so the first one is implicit prejudice, and it arises from our normal tendency to make associations and connections between things. As we make these associations and connections, we act very quickly, right? And that's great because it allows us to be more efficient. The challenge is what happens if the connection that you make is incorrect, right? So the way that we can see this playing out, one of the ways that you can see it is if you look at what we call classic resume studies, studies where they look at resumes. And what they do is they have 2 resumes, and they're the same. They're exactly the same. The only thing that's different is one name. One name will be a Western name versus not Western, or a name of traditionally a white-sounding name versus an ethnic name. And then you say, who should get the promotion, who should get entrance, who should get whatever opportunity these resumes are being evaluated for. Unfortunately, what we find pretty consistently is that the name that gets, the resume that gets selected is the resume that represents the majority person. Now, it's the same resume. It's the exact same resume. Yet we see this disturbing trend, not just in the US and in Australia, with Aboriginal names versus Caucasian names. Same thing, okay? And so we can see that these slanted evaluations might in fact lead to some qualified people not getting access to opportunities. Do you believe that that happens? Do you believe that happens? Shake your head or say yes. Okay, yeah. Okay, so that's one, implicit prejudice. Here's the thing, with each one of these biases, there's some positive aspects to it. You can make decisions more quickly when you make the associations fast. If I say thunder in the United States, people will say lightning right away. Thunder and lightning, they go together, right? Okay, so there are benefits to these biases, and you have to weigh that with the challenges as well, okay? So that's the first bias. The second is in-group favoritism. So here's the thing. We tend to do favors for people like ourselves. Does that happen here in India? Does it happen a lot in India? Yeah. It happens a lot everywhere. It's not just India. It happens a lot everywhere. That we do favors for people who are like us, right? Has anybody gotten a job because somebody made a call on your behalf and they opened a door for you? Has anybody gotten a job like that? Just show our hands. I'm the only person who got a job like that? Okay, I see some other people, thank you, right? That in fact, how we get ahead sometimes is by opening doors and helping people. Your children need to get to a particular school. Can you call somebody on the board and say, hey, can you help out here, right? You want to get into a particular job, you call somebody and say, hey, who's at this organization that you can connect me to? That happens all the time, right? That's great. The challenge is, what if you're not connected to the in-group? What if you are not connected to the people in power? What this does is it effectively discriminates against people who are not in the in-group. Does that make sense? Do you think it happens? Happens a lot. Okay, so that's another form of unconscious bias. The third form is overclaiming credit. Okay, so here's the thing. We can see when other people are acting in what we would call an average manner, but none of you think that you're average. You all think, I'm pretty good at what I do, right? And so we generally consider ourselves above average, and we actually sometimes can overestimate the contributions of our work. And we can be, particularly with people who are different from us, we can underestimate the contribution of their work, okay? What can happen as a result of this is that it's very hard to work across groups because we're boosting up our group and putting down the other group. You can see this at this is a macro level, a group level dynamic. The other two I talked about were more interpersonal and individual. But this one we can see with groups. And I understand from some of the dynamics that I see happening right now in India, we can see a lot of this. We can see a lot of overclaiming credit, undervaluing other groups, and a lack of ability to work together. Would you say that's happening right now? It's happening right now, right? Okay, last one is conflict of interest. This is when we are skewed in our decision making because we have two hats on. We have on a hat and these hats conflict with one another. Okay, so let's say you go into a boutique and you try on a suit or a dress, depending on what you like to put on when you go to boutiques. And the salesperson there tells you that you look fantastic in this outfit. You should buy it. You should buy two, right? But I'm here to tell you, you look horrible in the outfit. I'm sorry. You don't look so good in this outfit. You shouldn't buy one. You shouldn't buy two. You should put it down. You should pay somebody that you even tried this on. Now, why would this salesperson tell you that you look so good in this outfit? Why? They get the sales, they get a commission, right? Yeah, they get a little bit because you buy this outfit. So they're supposed to tell you how you really look so that you are evaluated effectively. That's the evaluation hat that they're supposed to have on. In fact, what they tell you is that you look good because they have on the hat of making money as well. Those two hats are conflicting with one another. Does that make sense? There's a conflict there. Their developer, their taking care of you hat is totally undermined by the fact that they want to get the commission. Well, that can happen. And in the US, a lot of our banking issues came about because people had these conflict of interest. They were supposed to be doing what's best for the customer, but they ended up doing what was best for themselves, right? So we see this conflict of interest, and it can lead to unintentionally corrupt behaviors. Okay, so what's happening with unconscious bias? This is still about diversity. What's happening is that we are jumping up what's called the ladder of inference. I love this graphic because it's very simple, yet it's really quite complex. What we see here is at the bottom, there's what we call a pool of data. If I had a videotape and I was just looking at you, videotaping your behavior, right, there would be some data that you could then select. But here's the challenge. We select some data to pay attention to, and we ignore some data. Do you believe that? We do. Okay, here's what makes it even more challenging. We select data that we expect to see. If we don't expect to see something, we actually don't see it. And here's an example. If I'm going to explain this, and I bet you somebody in the audience has done this. There is a YouTube video where you see these students in a circle bouncing a ball. And you have to count how many times they have bounced the ball. Has anybody seen this? You've seen it, okay. So you know what happens, right? Did you see it? First time, no. The gorilla. I'm going to tell them. Right. So you didn't see it the first time. Okay. Neither did I. So what happens is these kids are bouncing a ball. And after it's over, you are asked how many times they bounced the ball. And you're busy counting. You're looking. You're paying attention. And I was paying, it's 23 times that they bounced that ball. And then the facilitator said, did you see the gorilla that walked through those kids? And I'm like, there could not have possibly been a gorilla that walked through while I was watching. And he said, yes, there was, right? Wasn't there? Yep. And he shows the video again, and you see somebody dressed in a gorilla suit walks through, stops in the middle, beats their chest, and walks out. And they're actually rather obnoxious about it, okay? They're not subtle. They're very obnoxious about it. And so many people miss it the first time they see it because they're not looking for it. So we select data, but we don't see data that we don't expect to see. That's an important point, particularly if you think about diversity, okay? We affix meaning to that data, we make assumptions, we come to conclusions, we develop beliefs, we take action, and we do this faster than you can blink your eye. It's called jumping up the ladder of inference, jumping up the ladder of inference. We go like that. So fast, you're not even aware, right? Has anybody read the book Blink by Malcolm Gladwell? It's a good book. He talks about these concepts in social psychology. He makes it very accessible. So if you haven't read the book Blink, I recommend that you get it. For the people who read it, who read it? Show of hands. Worth reading? Yeah, pretty good book. It talks about this. Okay, so we jump up the ladder of inference. Okay, so if I had more time with you, I'd ask you to think about a time when you saw unconscious bias in action in your organization. For you to think back and say, have I seen unconscious bias in action? And I bet you have. I bet you can think of an example. If I give you time, everybody in here can think of an example. I'd ask for you to think of a time when you engaged in unconscious bias. And guess what? You would be able to figure out a time when you did it, right? And I'd ask you what the implications are for your organization. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to move on, but I'd ask you to use the worksheet and think about this later, because there are implications for us, for our organizations, from these questions. Okay, so some of the implications are, again, remember, everyone has unconscious bias. It touches every aspect of our life, every single aspect. And what we find is that in organizations, it affects who gets in, who's excluded, who moves ahead, who gets stalled, who receives rewards, who's punished, and a whole other list of things that I'm not saying here, right? It affects everything.
For example, the Nobel Prize, Gandhiji was the first candidate of the man of the century, and he didn't get it.
Right.
That's the bias right there.
Very good. That's an excellent example. And as I said, if I were to give you time, you guys could come up with big examples. You could come up with everyday examples that happen in your life. But this is big because this is all actually about dealing with diversity. Okay, so what do we do? How do we address this? How do we deal with the issues of unconscious bias? How do we deal with issues of diversity? Because that's what this is, right? So at the individual level, so I'm an organizational psychologist by training, so I think at the individual or the micro level, the group or the meso level, and the organizational or the macro level. So at the individual level, I suggest that you strengthen your EQ, your emotional quotient, your emotional intelligence. At the group level, we want to think about how to increase cultural intelligence. And at the organizational level, how do we think about paying attention to norms that might engender unconscious bias? So I'm going to talk just briefly about each one of those, and I'm going to turn it back over to the committee, okay? So the first thing is strengthening your emotional intelligence. People familiar with this concept, just raise your hands if you are. Daniel Goleman's work is very interesting, right? It talks about how is it that we pay attention to the signs around us in terms of our leadership. What Daniel Goleman suggests is that actually what makes a leader is your ability to leverage your emotional intelligence, right? And what allows us to deal with the unconscious bias is being aware of your emotional intelligence. Daniel Goleman gives us 5 categories of emotional intelligence, 5 kind of places you need to pay attention. So 2 of them are with you, your self-awareness and your self-regulation. Self-awareness, knowing your strengths, knowing your weaknesses, what challenges you, what gets on your nerves, what do you really like, what supports you, all of these different things. And being aware of those, being aware of when you're at your best and when you're at your worst, right? Self-regulation is really about emotion, and how is it that you don't let emotion get the best of you? How is it that you do not let emotion run the show? Okay? So self-regulation doesn't mean don't be emotional, it means don't let emotion run the show. Okay? Then there are 2 competencies that are with how you interact with others. So your ability to be empathetic, to be able to put yourself in other people's shoes, and your social skills. Your social skills are actually quite important. And the final competency that Goleman talks about is a bridge competency. You have to think about it for yourself and for others. It's really around motivation. How do you know what motivates you? How do you know what motivates others? How do you know what motivates you, what motivates others? Okay, so strengthening your EQ, paying attention to all of those different competencies is what we do at the individual level. At the group level, it's really how do you pay attention to cultural intelligence, knowing what it is that is somebody's culture versus what's idiosyncratic. How do you know it's just what they do individually versus this is what Indians do, right? That ability to know the distinction between those 2 things is really a global competency now. This is a global competency of how is it that you enhance your cultural intelligence. Okay, so with these, you want to be able to register all the different ways that personalities are interacting that are tied to culture. And one of the things that you have to do is think about suspending your judgment. So think before acting. You have to stop and reflect. Okay. Some of the components of cultural intelligence are cognitive, physical, and emotional and motivational. The last point is at the macro level, and when I work with organizations that are really interested in diversity, I tell them you actually have to do an audit of your firm, of your organization, to understand what's going on, right? And so how do you analyze and think about work practices that might inadvertently be getting in the way of diversity? So an organization called me and my colleagues in because they were having a difficult time keeping women. And they asked us to examine their culture and figure out what might be going on. Well, here's the thing we found. The really important meetings happened at 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. The meetings where all the decisions happen, where all of the power brokers were, that's when they happen, 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. Those times, 7 a.m. and 7 p.m., they're challenging for caretakers, right? For anybody taking care of children, of parents. If you're taking care of your dog or your cat or your favorite flower, 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. is hard, right? 7 a.m., 7 p.m., challenging times for caretakers of any kind. As it so happens, most of the time, the caretakers are still women, right? So caretaking and gender are conflated. Those are conflated, and as a result, we see work practices that actually discriminate against women. Not intentionally, but that's what happened. Does that make sense? Okay, so there's this thing of how is it that you look at the work culture to see what are the practices, what are the actions that are happening that might inadvertently hurt some people and help others. So there's a process for thinking about that, and I just shared it with you. You do a diagnosis, you think about your analysis, and you get feedback as a way of intervening. And how we want to pay attention to this why is that it allows for organizations to have what we call a dual agenda. If you actually figure out how it is that you have organizations be equitable for everybody, the organizations are actually more effective. So it's called the dual agenda, that equity actually leads to more effectiveness. Okay, so there are frameworks for managing diversity that help us to think about this in a broader scope. I'm going to refer you to an article or refer you to me. If you want to talk more about this, I'm going to make sure that you can contact me to delve more into this topic of how is it that we manage diversity. Paying attention to unconscious bias is just one of the ways. Paying attention to how diversity is managed in your organization is another way as well. But with that, I want to kind of close this out because I want to hand it back to the committee here. And I'm curious, I just want to hear from a couple people about anything resonate, your closing thoughts. Here?
On this cultural intelligence, I
Yeah.
just wanted to share the funny thing which comes on the internet. It's like they tell an Indian, if you go to New York, there you can in USA, you can kiss in public, but you can't piss in public.
Right.
In India, with due respect to all the Indians, though it doesn't happen so much often, you can piss in public, but you can never kiss in public.
That is cultural intelligence. I mean, in terms of looking at the differences in terms of what's expected.
Thank you.
What's appropriate in some cultures, what's not. It's an interesting example, right? But it is one that I've seen it actually, so I do understand that it's true.
First time that I was in New York on the tube, when I saw somebody kissing, and I said, oh, this is not never done in India.
Right, that is one way of thinking about cultural intelligence. Great. If I could hear from just a couple more people, what stood out? Yep, right up here.
Audible? Yeah. Professor, my name is Sunny, I'm with the media. I have a question. There are many organizations that genuinely believe that diversity is not the way to go. Everybody should adhere to a very strict dress code, and there is very little or hardly any gender diversity. So my question is, how do we, since we have the benefit of attending this seminar, go about instigating and bringing about changes in these kind of organizations?
It's a great question, and it speaks to these frameworks that I talked about. So there's an article that talks about the different kind of traditional paradigms that organizations have around diversity. And there are some where it's like, you know, we don't need to really focus on diversity. Everybody should be the same. Everybody should be the same. The challenge is that everybody's not the same, and that you miss opportunities to learn and leverage the different perspectives, the different ways of doing work when you miss that. And so one of the things that I suggest is if you show organizations the cost of them not paying attention, that tends to be motivating. That tends to be something that drives organizations is, wow, we're missing out because of this. So you can see when organizations miss an opportunity because their competitors move ahead, and that as a result, they're saying, wow, I'm missing this opportunity. So that's one way, is to show the cost. And that tends to be, oftentimes that's the way that organizations start. It's as a result of a crisis or perceived competition or loss of status or position as a result of that. That shouldn't be the driving force. You see, another way that it happens is if you have leaders who actually get it, who actually get the importance of diversity, then they can drive it from the top down. Now, what you will see with diversity is not ever just one, it's not ever bottom up or top down, it's both, right? So you have to figure out who the champions up here, who are the drivers down here, right? That's a good question, thank you. Let me just take one more. Something resonated, something stood out, something that you want to take away from this, something you'd like to share. If I could hear from one more person before I wrap us up. Yes. He's going to bring you the mic. Great.
Yeah, so in order to promote diversity, I'm observing that in last few years, organizations are promoting women. They are recruiting more women.
Yeah.
They are promoting to higher levels. And this sometimes creates dissonance also, because whether they have been promoted on the basis of competency or only gender.
Yeah, yeah. So this is good because this is actually the second paradigm up here, which is that one paradigm is, okay, let's get in the numbers, let's have diversity, let's have equal representation, let's treat them all the same. And then the second model is basically, well, let's celebrate difference. Let's get these folks in, and then let's put them in these specialized markets to allow them to bring in business to us, right? Neither of those works. Neither of those paradigms work. So how is it that we have people come in and that we really bring them in for what they can bring to the table, not because of a particular gender, not because of a particular race or caste or any of those different things, or age even, but that you have to think about leadership that provides a space for everybody to be there because of what they bring to the table. When organizations go too far the other way, it hurts them, and it hurts the people with whom they do that. And so there's a pushback. I just had my students at ISB do their critical incidents, and I have 70 students, and I think about 35 of them wrote about what you just said, that they're in organizations, they were in organizations that do that. It doesn't benefit. It doesn't benefit organizations when that happens. Okay, great. I'm going to close out, and then I'm going to turn it over with this quote. I like this. When I first started teaching about diversity, I was like, oh my gosh, this is something. There's so much emotion that comes around this topic, yet it's so important that we have to figure out ways to really leverage this. So a friend gave me a book, and this book had this quote, and I used this to help me think about my work with diversity. It says, little by little, I discovered that no matter who we are, you and I are on the same journey. We're all looking for the truths, asking critical questions, seeking meaningful answers. We're in this together, and our differences are a valuable resource as we work together. Something's become so obvious. Everyone has something important to contribute. We all hold a piece of the puzzle. Okay, we all hold a piece of the puzzle. But I'll close with this cartoon, because I'm a psychologist by training. And I love this elephant in the room that nobody's acknowledging, right? It's the elephant in the room. And in fact, diversity is sometimes the elephant in the room. It's the thing that's there, that's big as an elephant, that we're not acknowledging. It's absolutely essential that we stop pretending like it's not there, right? It's there. It's the elephant in the room, and we have to figure out how is it that we leverage that. Okay, so with that, there are some of the resources, and I'd be happy to share them with anybody. And thank you so much for allowing me to spend some time with you. I asked my students, what should I say when I'm very appreciative and very thankful for an opportunity that's been given to me? And they told me something, and I went and checked to make sure they didn't tell me something bad, right? Don't tell me to come up and say something that I'm not supposed to be saying. They said, no, no, no. They told me you should say shukriya. So shukriya.
Thank you, Professor Stacy, for that excellent and thought-provoking speech. It really helped bring our theme of diversity to life and the way you connected with the audience. Now we open the floor for a round of questions from the audience. It will be moderated by Mr. Keith D'Souza. I just request the audience to announce their name and organization before asking the question, and please keep the question short and relevant, keeping in mind the paucity of time. Thank you.
Stacy said she doesn't need any moderation, and I'm sure she doesn't. So, if there are other questions, I'd love to. Yeah.
So I think we spoke about unconscious bias. I think it's a lot to do with the way we have been born and brought up, by our parents, family, culture, etc., etc. With the kind of research which you have been doing, you spend so much time in this. Can you tell us few quick things which we can take care of when we are raising children so that this problem can be taken care of at least in years to come? Thank you.
This is great. So raising kids, right? What are some things that we can do? I mean, part of it is expose your kids to a variety of perspectives, a variety of people, variety of activities. Here's the thing, we oftentimes, we do learn as kids what's appropriate, what colors you should wear, what activities you should be part of. That's all unconscious bias, that there are girly things and boy things, right? And so how is it that you stop adults from imposing that on kids so young, right? So if there's a girl who wants to do something that seems to be more boyish, can she do that? So what kind of activities do we expose them to? Not so much pushing down that you must do it this way, which I understand is hard in just about any culture, but particularly challenging in this one, given the norms, the strong norms about who you should be with, right? About how you find your partner, about what kind of jobs you have, about whether you should even work or not, right? So these are all the things that I'm hearing from the students and the organizations that I work with here. So it would be nice to do those things. It's challenging because you're not operating in a vacuum. You're operating in the context of a much larger societal issue. But here's the thing, you guys are India is changing. This is a very exciting time to be in India. From my thought, it's very exciting. You guys are right in the middle of a country that's shifting from old to new. And in some ways, you're already there. You're 35 or 40 years ahead of us in the US. And in some ways, you're here. You got 35 years to go. You have both. Does that make sense? Right? So it's really exciting to be here now, to think about what do we do with our kids, but also what do you all do with each other?
Simple one. You talked about unconscious bias and fairness,
Yeah.
but if you look at Indian organizations for the last 5 years, there is a quite thirst in the referral policies. So basically what you're doing is you're referring a person whom you have known and you want to get that person into your organization. These two thoughts, they contradict each other, right?
Well, I mean, it gets to the same point that was raised by this gentleman right here, right? And so as organizations are dealing with change, not just diversity, but change of any kind, they swing. It's a pendulum. So you're here, and then something happens, and you react, and you go over here, and then you go back over here, so they swing. And the goal is to get to the middle at some point, but organizations take time to do that. Would you agree? Right, they swing. And so as a result of the interest in promoting gender, which is an issue here, if you look at the different global statistics around gender, India is in the bottom quartile. It is ranked among the worst places around gender in the world. Does that make sense? Yet, if you look at the population, you guys don't have a choice. You have so many women in India. You're going to have to draw upon women because you don't have a choice. You're going to be missing out if you don't, right? So as a result, India is doing this, right? We know we need to do something. We've got to pay attention, so let's do this. And it's extreme, right? And we did the same thing in the US. We did the same thing in the US before. And so you learn as you go along the curve about how is it that you encourage diversity without doing it through a reservation system or through affirmative action policies that really can get in the way because they're oftentimes not implemented correctly. Right? It's not that the thought is wrong, that we want to increase the representation, but how it happens and for what reason and all of that can make it really tricky and actually negate what your intent is to do.
Just to add to his point, in fact, referral is one aspect of entire selection procedure. but the selection is left to the company. The philosophy of actually referrals, which I believe is in my organization, is also promoting my previous organization was promoted. That is, people tend to like working in a group where we know each other well. So I think that's one of the basic reasons why referrals are, given in the organization. But at the end of the day, organization, people to refer.
Yeah, it's one of the forms of unconscious bias. We like being around people who are like us, right? And so this is going to shift because everybody's not like you. We have got to realize that gender is a big and upcoming issue in India, and it's an opportunity. It's a powerful opportunity. And there will be challenges in terms of how it's put forward, but there's also opportunity. It's a great opportunity. So organizations are going to correct themselves around that. They'll figure out ways to bring in women such that it's not because of we have to check a box saying that we have so many women in this way. I promise that will happen because that's what happens.
Known people is better than unknown.
Excuse me?
It is said that
Yeah.
known people is better than unknown.
You want to go with what you know. Okay, so is it this issue? Because we could talk about this issue for a while, right? I mean, it's a touchy, it's a topic that always raises a lot of heat. In my class, my students and I talk about this, and I say we can talk about it for a little bit, and then we need to move past it. Right? And so if it's about this issue, I'd like to defer and move to another question, and I'll just take one more, right? Yep. He's got the mic right there for you.
So my question is, I know we talked a lot about unconscious bias, right? But as a country, with the statistics you mentioned and us being so skewed, are we at a point where we are facing unconscious bias, or are we still at a point where we have a lot of conscious bias, which has to be translated through intent to unconscious bias?
Well, I think, that there's both that are there, that the unconscious bias is still very much playing there. Like I ask people, do you guys talk about caste? Do you talk about caste? You don't, no more, and that's what I hear. Every time I ask people, they say, no more, we don't talk about it anymore. And I say, is it important? And people say, no, it's not important. Is that true? Right? But whenever I ask people, I say, is it important? They say, no, it's not important. We don't talk about it. It's not an issue. It's not an issue. Right? And so there's the things that are conscious and there's unconscious and there's both that are happening here. Right? You have some things that are there that are very conscious about. A lot of it, though, is underneath, and we don't talk about it because we don't know how. It's not comfortable. We're not sure how to deal with it. It's really challenging. Okay, so you have both. You have conscious and unconscious bias. Enough unconscious bias where you do have to pay attention, and enough conscious bias where I see that there's moves that are being taken to start to address that. Great. Yes? Sure. This is the last question right here.
About this self-awareness and regulation.
Yeah.
Perhaps it is, in my own humble opinion, it is one of the most difficult tasks and it is easier said than done. Can you please elaborate what are the challenges of HR in inculcating this self-awareness and this among the employees in general? So I believe this issue will resolve the entire issues of the company in general and the nation in particular. What are the challenges of the HR in inculcating a culture of self-awareness and regulation? Can you elaborate, please?
Sure, and I think that some of our...
I just want to add to this question. Based on this emotional intelligence and unbiased,
unconscious bias. Yeah.
How would you say if a panel of judges of 3 HR people and 2 candidates walk in, they say love at first sight. So the human mind automatically likes somebody at first sight and somebody no. How are they, 3 of them, are going to resolve the conflict amongst themselves?
That's great.
2 people may like one person may like another.
Okay, so that's slightly different than what you're asking, and I'm going to go with what you're asking, but it will touch on some of what you're saying. I think our panel, people like the gentleman right here and the other panel are going to speak to this issue of like, what do you actually do, right? So around self-awareness, I and some of the other panelists, just about all of them, do coaching, right? We do coaching to help people think about how is it that you are conscious about your strengths, your opportunities, your developmental, not your weaknesses, but your developmental opportunities is what we call it, right? And I, as a person who teaches this and coaches this and consults on this and research on this, I constantly stop and pay attention to my self-awareness. So with my students, I have them do different exercises. Are you familiar with the Myers-Briggs indicator test? Who's taking it? Do you know your personality type? What is it? ESTJ. ESTJ. Who else is taking the Myers-Briggs? Do you remember your personality type? What is it? INTJ. INTJ. E. Okay, E. What about right here? ESTP. ESTP. What about right there? INTJ. ENTJ. Okay, great. See, you see that tool? And everybody who took it, you remember your type, don't you? And isn't your type information? My information, I am a ENFP. ENFP. When I was in graduate school, I became an ENFJ. I changed from a P to a J. People who know that, does that make sense? It does.
I changed from a T to an F.
You changed from a T to an F. Okay, this is self-awareness, is being aware of how you tend to act, and there are tools to help you do that. The Myers-Briggs is one. There are lots of different tools. Coaching, getting the help that you need, stopping and taking a time to reflect, and knowing that it's important that you actually do that. So a lot of programs, a lot of corporations are now doing leadership development programs, right? A lot of organizations are sponsoring leadership development programs, and it's all about how is it that you enhance self-awareness, because if you don't have that, you can't lead anybody. You can't lead somebody if you're not self-aware. Do you believe that? It's true, actually. If you are not aware, if you don't know what moves you, if you're not certain about what's important to you, it's very difficult for you to bring somebody else along. So self-awareness is actually at the core of leadership. Okay, I would love to talk with you more, but I've gotten the signal I'm being yanked. I'm being yanked off the stage, right? Thank you all so much, and I'll be around, so I appreciate it so much. Thank you.